All right, Charazun, Yomi, all right? Perfect. All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Teves, the Daf Yomi shir for dedicating all the Shuman Drushos this month in memory of Mr. Milton Martyr, Mordechai David Ben Rafal HaKohen Zichron Livracha. To thank Shirley Elbaum family for dedicating the shiurim this month, the commission of the yard site of Sherry Elbaum, Yaakov couple Ben Avram Menachem. To thank our week of learning sponsors, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating the learning this week in commemoration of the yard site of Paul's sister, Leah Bas Shmuel Zichron Livracha, and to thank Ayala and Sarah Steinberg for dedicating the shiurim this week in the Schus of Refuah Shlema for Shulamis Bas Sushu. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all those who require refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. All of the neshamas should have an aliyah, and the families in nechama. With that, let us begin. So, really interesting daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Samech Tes 69, and we are actually picking up on daf Samech Tes Amud Beis 69a. Sorry, 69. Samech Tes Amud Aleph. Sorry about that. 2, 4, 5 lines down from the top. 5 lines down from the top. Okay, sorry. Good. 5 lines down from the top. So the Gemara says as follows. So remember again, yesterday's daf, we ended off with it was a quasi-resolution. We had an interesting question. What we've established, this entire parak so far, has been really focused on one particular detail, namely the annulment of a vow of a nara ha'me'urasa. So remember again, a very specific case of a nara between the age of 12 and 12 and a half, 12 years old and 6 months, in a state of erusin, who has the power of revocation over her vows. So we've established is that it must be a joint effort between her father and her husband. We've also established, at least we thought initially, that it has to be done jointly and simultaneously. So now I will say what we also established, but in yesterday's daf, we saw the concept of partial revocation. And understand that partial revocation seemingly has some type of effect. So remember again, we had 2 possibilities. Either again, megas gaiz, partial revocation lops off 50% of the neder, or miklash kalish. It has the ability generally to weaken the neder, to downgrade the neder to a lesser form of severity. So we'll say, so essentially what we ended off in yesterday's daf was, which one is correct? So machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai holds megas gaiz, and Beis Hillel holds miklash kalish. So we'll say, fine. With that, let's go back there. So by Rava asked the following question. Yesh she'ela b'hakim, or in she'ela b'hakim. So it's a very interesting question. So I will say, let's take the following scenario. So let's say Nara Me'urasa made a neder. And now what happened? Father affirmed the neder. Father affirmed the neder. I will say now affirmation could take one of 2 ways. Either the father says, I positively affirm the neder, or he's quiet for that entire day, in which case it becomes a de facto affirmation. Let's go with the first approach, where halacha, we'll see what I said in just a moment, where he says, right, Nara Murasa makes the neder, father affirms it, and now what does he want? He wants revocation of his affirmation. So is there such a concept like that? Yesh she'ela b'hakim, o ein she'ela b'hakim, is there ability to go ahead and revoke affirmation or not? So we'll say, so take a look, by the way, in the Ran, it's in the wide lines, 2, 4, 6, 7 lines in. By Rabbi Yeshel B'Hakim, Rabbi says, Im kiyam neder, v'nishal bo bayom alahekim. So we'll say, let's say again, the father affirmed the neder, and now he wants to revoke that affirmation on that very day. Mi matzi mefer bo bayom olo. So we'll say, ultimately again, does he have the ability to revoke the affirmation on that day or not? Now the Ran points out, aval mocher pshita delo matzi mefer delo gara mishtika. And I will say the shayla only comes up when day of, because obviously again, if he's quiet the entire first day, by definition, that's affirmation. There's no revocation. So shayla is day of. He affirmed the neder. Does he have the ability to go ahead and revoke that affirmation? I will say, I'll just point you just for a moment to the Rush. If you take a look at the Rush, No, actually, let's go back to it. Let's finish. So the Gemara says, Imtim Salamar Yesh She'ila B'Hakim. So back to the Gemara. So Rava says, this is Rava's Kasha. Is there such a concept ultimately again? The father affirmed the neder. Can he now revoke that affirmation on that day? So says the Gemara, Imtim Salamar Yesh She'ila B'Hakim. If you say that there is revocation by affirmation, Yesh She'ila B'Hafer, O Ein She'ila B'Hafer. So I'll say then the follow-up question is there revocation for annulment or not? Others will say, so let's just the reverse, right? So question number one was, if the father affirms the neder on the day that he heard it, right? She made the neder, he affirmed it. Can he then revoke his affirmation? Or what the Gemara is asking is there a process by which the father goes to a Talmid Chacham, to a Beis Din for revocation of his affirmation? Okay, part two of that question is, what about the reverse? Let's say he annulled the neder. Is there revocation for annulment? Is there revocation for annulment? Right? There's a she'ila b'hakim, is she'ila b'hafer, or ein she'ila b'hafer. Or is there no revocation ultimately again for annulment? To which the Gemara will say, now by the way, now take a look at the Rush for just a moment. Take a look at the Rush for just one moment. So we'll say, so this is the Rush in the wide lines, 2, 4, 6, 7 lines in the end of the 7th wide line in the Rush. Yeshele b'hafar olo. It was actually very interesting. Mi amrinon, kevan de yeshele b'hakim huad dinami b'hafar. So on one hand, maybe what Rav is saying is like this. If you're going to tell me that there's revocation with affirmation, then there should also be revocation for annulment. Right? This is therefore again, who had din nami behefer, tim hefer v'nishal chacham al hafaraso chazer haned lekadmuso. So I will say, oh Dilma, look what the Rash says. Perhaps nihidi sheila lahakem haynu mishum dikiyum neder kineder dami aval hafara ein lo sheila. So I will say, the reason why I would think that maybe they're different. Where is why? Because I will say, if you affirm a neder, right? If you affirm a neder, so I'll say, affirmation of a neder, if you think about it, when the father affirms the neder, has he really done anything? Not really. In other words, had he not done anything, the neder would have been affirmed. So maybe it's easier to overturn a process where the father hasn't really done anything, as opposed to annulment. When the father has annulled the neder, has he done something? Absolutely. It's much harder to undo something that you've actually done versus to undo something that you haven't really done anything to. I know that wasn't good English, but you understand, right? Others will say, so the Ma'aseh said that's the distinction. That's the distinction. So Rav say, so Rav is therefore asking two shaylas. Could a father go ahead and revoke his affirmation? That's part one. Part two, can he revoke his annulment? To which the Gemara says, so Tashma, Dam Rabbi Yochanan nish'alin ala hekem, ve'in nish'alin ala hefer. So Rabbi Yochanan says, you can go ahead and revoke affirmation, but you cannot go ahead and revoke revocation. So Rabbi say, if the father affirmed the neder, he can go to a Beis Din, and there's a process. In other words, he can't revoke his affirmation by himself. Right? He needs to go through a process for that. But halacha l'maaseh, there is a process for revocation of affirmation, but there is no ability to revoke his annulment. So I'll say, so that is how the Gemara paskins. And again, it's just interesting to see how the Rush frames the difference between the two. And I will say, I want to point out over here, this is how the Rambam paskins. So if we take a look in Hilchos Nedarim, we don't have to look, I'm going to read it to you. Hilchos Nedarim, Perek Yud Gimel, Halacha Chaf. So the Rambam writes as follows: Hamakayim nidre bita o ishto v'nicham. Well, so here it is. A person affirms the neder of his daughter or of his wife, and then he has remorse for doing it. Right? He regrets having done it. Nishal l'chacham umatir lo hakamaso. He can go to a chacham, and the chacham has the ability to go ahead and annul the affirmation. The choser umeifar la bo bayo. Now, we'll say, so here's what's interesting. The Rambam just fills in the blank over here, which is, let's play this out. Right, Ruvain is the father. Let's just keep it with the Gemara. His daughter, the Nara Hamurasa, went ahead and made a neder. What did Ruvain do? He affirmed the neder. he then has remorse that he affirmed it. So what does he do? He goes to Talmid Chacham. Talmid Chacham revokes his affirmation. Rabbi say, what happens now that the affirmation is revoked? What happens now? Essentially, we're back to square one. So now Rabbi say, what does he have to do? Now he has to annul the neder, right? In other words, revocation of affirmation just puts him back at square one, right? It doesn't actually do anything to the neder. Now that his affirmation has been revoked, if he chooses, he could what? He could now annul the neder. So Rabbi said just that the Gemara doesn't mention that point, but the Rambam says it. Aval im hefer lavenichem. But Rabbi say if he annulled the neder, and then he had remorse that he went and he annulled the neder. So I'll say there is no revocation ultimately again on annulment. So I'll say that's how the Rambam paskins. So ultimately again, there's revocation on affirmation. Once the affirmation is revoked, father then has the ability to actively annul the neder. He's got to do something if he wants to annul the neder, but there is no revocation ultimately on annulment. Incredible. So, I'm sorry? So we're going to get around from yesterday. Good. I haven't forgotten about it. I haven't forgotten. So, by Rabbi, you're going to see why I'm saving it. So, by Rabbi, so we'll say, so Rabbi asked the following shaila. Kiem lechi. So we'll say it's case number 2. Well, first one was Rava, now this is Rabbi. So here's Rabbi's kasha. Let's say, we'll keep it the same case, right? So, father of Nara Murasa, daughter Nara Murasa makes a neder, and the father says, Kiem lechi. The neder is upheld for you, the neder is upheld for you. Right, so he uses this double lashon. V'nishal al hakama rishona mahu. Supposed to listen to this. Now, obviously, when he says kiyem lechi, they will say, what's the status of the second kiyem lechi? What's the status of that? It's meaningless. It's meaningless. They will say, now watch this. What happens, however, if he petitions for revocation of the first affirmation? We'll say, so these questions are building on each other. So remember again, what Rava just taught us, or Rabbi Yochanan just taught us, is that halacha l'maisa, there is revocation for affirmation. Okay, so now what happens? Case number 2, right? Father says to his daughter, kiyem lechi, your neder is upheld, your neder is upheld. So generally, the second affirmation is meaningless, right? Now, what happens? I will say, what happens, however, if halacha l'maisa, he goes to a chacham and he has the first affirmation revoked. Mahu. So I'll say, so what is the halacha? Now, I will say, now what is the Gemara asking? Take a look at the Ran again. So I'll say, this is the Ran 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, about 12 lines up from the bottom. So by Rabbah, kiyem lechi, b'nisha ala kama rishona mahu, mi amrinon, Kevan de beidna da apik hakama shnia mipumei lo chayli su lo chayla. So we'll say, do we say that since when he first said the first kiyem lechi, such a statement was meaningless, therefore again I will say kind of disappears, just totally disappears. O Dilma nehi de bahi shaita lo chayla haynu mishum da bahi shaita isila kama kamaisa de lo shavkale lebasraisa lemechal aval I itshal akamaisa. Mashachta basraisa ravcha v'chayla. So we'll say, here's how the Ran frames it. So when he says, kaima lechi, or kiyem lechi. So in general, we'll say there are 2 ways to we view that redundant statements. On one hand, we say, look, that second statement is meaningless. There's nothing to talk about. Therefore, it kind of just falls away. It just disappears on its own. Or maybe the second possibility says that, no, what happens? When he makes it initially, the second kiyem lechi doesn't mean anything because it doesn't do anything, but it's still hovering around. Ultimately, again, were he to revoke the first affirmation, what would happen? The second affirmation would automatically set in. That's the shaila. So Tashma will say, so let's analyze. So Tashma, Dama Rava, Imnishal ala Rishona, Shnia Chalalav. All right, we'll say pretty straightforward. Rava answered this also, and Rava said, if he has revocation on the first affirmation, the second one sets in. Said Rabbi Paskins, the second kiyem lechi never really goes away. It kind of hovers around. And once the first one is revoked, the second one has the ability to ultimately set in. Incredible. So I'll say this is how the Rambam Paskins as well. Amr Labito, suppose it's the Rambam. It's all the same. It's all the same parak in Hilchos Nedarim, parak Yud Gimel. Amr Labito leishto kiyem lich. Man says to his husband, to his wife or to his daughter, so ultimately, again, I'm upholding this neder for you, I'm upholding this neder for you. V'nishal al hakama harishona, and then he has revocation on the first affirmation. Hari ashniya chala alav. The second affirmation ultimately again sets in. Good. So we'll say now two questions asked, two questions answered. Let's go back there. By Rabbah. So we'll say ultimately again, Rabbah comes along and asks another kasha. Kiem lechi umufar lechi. So we'll say this is a bit more of a convoluted case. It's actually quite interesting. So we'll say, now watch this. Father, for just a moment. So now father says to the daughter, Kiem lechi umufar lechi. I am upholding your neder and I am annulling your neder. And ultimately, again, the affirmation should only take effect if the revocation takes effect. What? I don't know what I was going to say. So again, remember, essentially what the father has done in this case is he's made an inherently contradictory statement. So literally, again, there's two parts of the contradiction. First part is the neder is upheld for you, the neder is affirmed, the neder is annulled. Neder is affirmed, the neder is annulled, and ultimately the affirmation should only take effect if the neder is annulled. Okay, so as I said, obviously we have an inherently contradictory statement. So I will say, so what's the shaila? Mahu. So the Gemara says, what do I do with this? Now before you turn the page, take a quick look at the last rush on Amud Aleph. Quick look at the last rush on Amud Aleph. So listen to this. Vadai im amar kiem lechi umufar lechi. So we'll say, now listen to this. So the Rosh just points on the average, which is very interesting over here. If the father would have just said, or I'm saying the father, but it's the father or the husband, right? Or let's just give it the father. If the father would have said, kiem lechi umufar lechi. Let's say he would have just said this, right? The neder is upheld for you and the neder is annulled. So the Rosh says this would be easier. Would not have added on, would not have appended the second part of the statement. Pshita dechala hakama sha'amar b'tchila v'shuv lo sachal hafara. So I will say we're going to talk about this in just a moment. If the father would have just said Kiem lechi mufar lechi, that would have been an easy case. Why? Because we'll say what would we have said in that case? We would have said Tafas Lashon Rishon, grabbed the first Lashon, and would have just said he's upholding the neder, and would have ignored the second part. The problem is, V'shuv lo sachol afara. David Rabbi Yossi da'amra af bigmar g'dvar v'adam nitvas tavayu hani mili gabi olo shlam di chol. Good, we're going to leave that. Good. Aval hacha, look at the last part of the Aval hacha, the efshar lochol ze achar ze, mod Rabbi Yossi. So we'll say, the problem the Rosh is just pointing out over here, the problem is not with the first part of the statement. The problem is with the second part of the statement. Because in general, we'll say, we're going to see, when you make two contradictory statements that cannot both be true, in general, we'll just seize the first one. So if you were to say, so in this case, when he says, Kiem lechi mufar lechi, that by itself, we would just say, Kiem, he was upholding the neder. The problem we'll say is that he appended the second part to the statement, and he said, the hakama, right, look how this goes. The neder is upheld, the neder is revoked. But the affirmation should only take effect if there's a revocation. So I'll say, so the problem just is he linked this second part to the first part, and I have absolutely no idea what he is saying. So Mahu, so what is the halacha in this case? Well, I'll say Amud Beis. So Tashma, let's analyze this. So Tashma, we plugged there, we may have Rabbi Yossi. So we'll say, let's analyze this from the Machlokes Rabbi Yossi. What's the Machlokes Rabbi Yossi? We'll say it's a great case. We've actually seen this before. We've seen this before. The Gemara says, so this nan, Harizu Tmuras Ola, Tmuras Shlamim. Now we'll say, okay, so here's what you have over here. What's Tmura? So Tmura is an illegal swap. Right, an illegal swap. So in other words, when you have an animal that's consecrated, you are not allowed to go ahead and exchange that animal for something else. In this case over here, a person has an animal, and what does he say? This animal ultimately again should be a tmuras ola, tmuras shlamim. And I will say, now he's making both of these statements. It should be a Tamura for Ola and a Tamura for Shlamim. So I will say, so what's going on over here? So first I'll take a quick look at the Rush. The Rush I will say is in the left-hand column. We're going to be looking at a couple of Rushes over here. Less around on this page, more Rush. So the Rush is on the left-hand side. Rabbi Meir Rabbi Yossi, skip a little bit. He says, Disnan Harizu Tmuras Ola. Mishnahi beparakit said Marimin. Harez, so we'll say, what's the halacha? If you say, I'm sorry, I didn't read enough of the Gemara. Back to the Gemara just for a moment. Tashma Rabbi Meir Rabbi Yossi. Disnan. A person says about a particular animal, this animal should be both a Tmuras Ola and a Tmuras Shlamim. I will say, remember, an Ola and the Shlamim are two different karbanos, right? An Ola is fully offered up on the Mizbeach. A Shlamim is divided into three parts. Part of it goes in the Mizbeach, part of it goes to the Kohanim, part of it goes to the owner. So now a person is saying this animal should be a Tmura for Ola and Shlamim. So we'll say, so what do you do with it? Harezet Tmuras Ola div Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says, we look at this animal as the Tmura for an Ola. Tmura for an Ola. We'll say, take a look at the Rush again. Harezet Tmuras Ola. The Tafas Lashon Rishon Midelo Kamar Tmuras Ola Ushlamim. Now we'll say in Rabbi Meir's view, when you make two independent statements simultaneously, right? Like in this case over here, right? I'm saying this animal should be Tmuras Ola and Tmuras Shlamim, and you can't be both. Therefore, what? We take the first lashon, Tafas lashon Rishon. This is in general the position of Rabbi Meir, right? Take the first lashon. Therefore, we look at this animal as a Tmuras Ola. So we'll say Rabbi Yossi says in Lekach Niskave Mitchila. Rabbi Yossi says like this. Let's look at what his kavana was, right? In other words, we'll say if we ask him, what's your kavana? If he says, my kavana is I want this animal to be both a Tmuras Ola and Tmuras Shlamim. That's literally, that's what I want. But rather again, the Ifshar Likros Shnei Shemos Ke'echad. But he says, look, if I could say Tmuras Ola, Tmuras Shlamim, if I could say it simultaneously, I would. But because I can't say it simultaneously, therefore what? I have no choice but to say it one after the other. Dvarav kayamin. Ultimately, again, his words are upheld. Now we'll say, what does it mean his words are upheld? Once again, take a look at the Rush. Dvarav kayamin. So we'll say, now, before we actually look at the Rush, so what does that mean? So let's say, so watch this. So let's just frame the case again. We'll say, just I want to point out, what are we trying to answer over here? Let's just pause for a second. What's our question? Right? Daughter Nara Murasa made a neder. What did the father say? Father said, Dvarav, right? Kiyem lechi, mufar lechi. The neder is affirmed, the neder is revoked. But the affirmation should only be chal if the revocation is chal. An inherently contradictory statement. So what do we do with it? Okay, Gemara is trying to prove it from this case over here. Guy comes along and says, this animal should be a Tmuras Ola, Tmuras Shlamim. Contradictory statement. Rabbi Meir says, Tafas Lashon Rishon. It's a Tmuras Ola. That's the first thing he said. Rabbi Yossi says, well, one second, let's take a step back. Let's ask him, what's your kavana? If his kavana ultimately, again, that he would like this animal to be both a Tmuras or Tmuras Shlamim, and if he could have said both statements simultaneously, he would have done so, then ultimately, again, Dvarav Kayamin, then his statement is in effect, and we make this animal both an Ola and a Tmura of an Ola and the Shlamim. And I both say, how do you make it both? Now take a look at the Rush again. Dvarav Kayamin. Both say, again, Rush, left-hand column, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, about 12 lines down from the top. Dvarav Kayamin, Vitira, Ache Tistaiv, V'yavi b'dmei chetzi ola v'chetzi shlomo. So what do you do with this animal? Essentially, again, let it graze until it develops a mum. Once it develops a mum, what can you do with it? Sell it and split the proceeds between an ola and the shlamim. Between the ola and the shlamim. So the Gemara says, Va'afil Rabbi Meir lo ka'amar, and even Rabbi Meir, even Rabbi Meir who said Tafas Lashon Rishon, even Rabbi Meir. Rabbi said the Gerus over here has changed. The Bach changes it. Va'afil Rabbi Meir lo ka'amar ela delo amar. Even Rabbi Meir, right? Even Rabbi Meir, ultimately, Va'afil Rabbi Meir lo ka'amar. He didn't say only in the case where you did not say lo seichel zeh ela imkein chalazu. right? Lo seichel zu im elam kin chalazu. And Rabbi Meir said, this is not talking about a case where a person said, this should not be chal unless this is chal. Aval hacha the amar lo seichel hakama ele imkein chala hafara. Rabbi say in this case, shall be back to our Nedarim case now, where the father said, ultimately the affirmation should only go ahead and be chal if the revocation is chal. Rabbi Meir nami moda hafara chala. Even Rabbi Meir would agree ultimately that what? That the hafara, that the revocation ultimately takes effect. So we'll say, so pretty incredible. So we'll say, so ultimately, again, the Gemara is suggesting over here that even Rabbi Meir, so we'll say, so here's what's fascinating, right? Let's just analyze this. The sheet of Rabbi Yossi is, if the guy meant to say both things, so we'll say, let me take one more step back. When a person says, Hareze Timuras Ola Ushlamim, they both say, when we look at that statement, what do we see? An inherent contradiction. So we'll say, and that's what Rabbi Meir sees. So how do you resolve an inherent contradiction? Tafas Lashon Rishon. Just grab the first Lashon, therefore it's Timuras Ola. Rabbi Yossi says, no, maybe it's not an inherent contradiction. Maybe what he means ultimately again is for these two things to actually occur. So therefore, Lamaisa again, we have to, if that's his kavana, how do we make that happen? So once again, we let it graze until it develops a mum. Once it develops a mum, sell it off, right? Split the proceeds between Ola and Shlamim. So we'll say, so bepashtos, we would say, that would be the same thing over here in our inherently contradictory neder case. Kiyem lechi, mufar lechi, and the akama should only be chal if the afara is chal. If the afara is chal. So we'll say, so bepashtos, we would say that Rabbi Meir would say tafas lashon rishon, just go ahead and take the first lashon, and Rabbi Yossi would somehow reconcile the two. To which the Gemara says, even Rabbi Meir agrees in this case. Why? Because halacha lamaisa, the person made it explicit that A should only be chal if B is chal. In that case, again, even Rabbi Meir would agree that ultimately, again, the hafara, the revocation, ultimately takes effect. Take a quick look at the Rush again. Take a look at the Rush again. So the Rush says, Rabbi Meir nami moded da hafara chala, perish harav elazar v'akama lav klumhi. So really what's happening over here is as follows. Even Rabbi Meir would agree that in this case, halacha l'maisa, the hafara is chal. So we'll say, so therefore the way we interpret this statement, the neder is upheld, right? The neder is affirmed, the neder is revoked, and the affirmation should only take effect if there is revocation. The way we interpret this statement, Rabbi says, how? This is a hafara. This is a revocation. It is a long-winded form of revocation. Even Rabbi Meir, ultimately, again, even Rabbi Meir who normally says what? Even Rabbi Meir who says, Tafas Lashon Rishon, grab the first Lashon, would agree that in this case, ultimately, again, this is an elongated form of revocation. So I will say, so the Rambam quotes this halacha as well. And this is Parak Yud Gimel halacha on base. Well, so here it is. Get ready. Amar la. I'm going to read to you in the Rambam. Amar la. Kiyem lech umufar lech. Right? Father says to the daughter, or husband says to the wife, either way. Kiyem lech umufar lech. This neder is upheld for you. This neder is annulled for you. And the affirmation should only take effect if the revocation takes effect. Harezem mufar. So I will say the Rambam just gets right to it. This neder is annulled. Why is the neder annulled? She'ein hakama moil achar hafara. Ultimately, again, because affirmation cannot work after revocation. So we'll say, essentially what the Rambam is saying is, once you're including revocation in there, we're done. We'll say that's the takeaway from this. So once you are saying that you're revoking, that's what we look at. Once there's revocation involved, that's it. And even I will say the chiddush over here is even Rabbi Meir, who normally says tafas lashon rishon, go ahead and grab the first lashon, would agree in this case, since you've mentioned revocation, the neder is revoked. Done. We'll say next question. Good, we're knocking these off one after the other. Great. So we'll say the Gemara says as follows. Next, Bai Rabba. We'll say 2, 4, 5 lines from the bottom. Bai Rabba. Rabba has found in Kasha. Kiem umufar lechi bebas achos mahu. All right, so we'll say this is interesting. So what happens if halacha lamaisa? He says to her, Kiyem umufar lechi. Literally, again, he's saying this neder, and I will say, I want to contrast the cases. In the previous case, what did he say? Kiyem lechi, mufar lechi. Two different lashonos. In this case, what is he doing, Rabbi say? He's combining them even more. He's saying, Kiyem umufar lechi. So Rabbi say, you see what the difference is? It's not even two independent lashonos. It's a combined lashon of kiyem umufar lechi. It's combining them into one. So Mahu, what is the halacha in this case? I will say once again, I'm sorry, take a look at the Rush. I apologize, I'm not a small print today. So kiyem umufar lechi b'bas the Rush says, Perish, kevan shelo amar elapam achas lechi hainu b'bas. So I will say, what makes this bas achas? What makes this bas achas is opposed to the previous case, where there are two independent lashonos. Kiyem lechi, mufar lechi. Granted, you're saying them at the same time, but there's still two independent lashonos. In this case, you're saying the two lashonos at once. Kiyem lechi, mufar lechi. Excuse me. Kiyem umufar lechi. So it's bebas achos. What's the halacha? So look at the Rush. Mi amrinan tafas lashon rishon. Do we see, like Rabbi Meir says, look at the first lashon, and since the first lashon was hakama, was affirmation, that therefore again this should be looked at as affirmation of the neder. O dilma kevan da'arun b'bas achos chala hafara umevatelas hakama. Or since the bas achos, since there is a simultaneity over here, it's bas achos. Therefore, what? Perhaps the revocation should come and annul the affirmation. So we'll say, so again, that's the shaila. So we'll say, see, we're going through a progression of cases. So you see what's happening over here? So in this case, kiyem umufar lechi. So there's a bas achos, there's a simultaneity. So what's the question? Do we say tafas lashon rishon? And therefore what? Halacha l'maisa, this is an affirmation. Or since it's the bas achos, therefore again, we look at the hafara, we look at the annulment. So it says the Gemara, so kiyem umufar lechi bas achos ma'u, so tashma. So let's analyze this. So the Amar Rabbi said, "Kol davar she'enu b'zach hazeh, afilu b'bas achas eino." So it says it's very interesting. So Rabbi said, anything that cannot happen successively could also not happen simultaneously. This is the position of Rabbi. And I will say, now where did Rabbi say this? Once again, I'm sorry, take a look at the Rush. So the Rush says over here, "Kol she'enu b'zach hazeh, afilu b'bas achas eino." So it's actually a very interesting case. Kabi mekadish beis achayos. O isha ubita. You're supposed to listen to this. Let's say a man goes over to a woman and her daughter, and he says to both the mother and the daughter, right? Both of you are mikudeshes to me. So Rabbi say, so now the shaila is, what's the halacha? So Rabbi says anything that can take place successively also can't take place simultaneously. So therefore, again, you can't be mekadesh a woman and her daughter because you're not allowed to marry a mother and a daughter. Same thing with two sisters. So Lamaisa, because you could not do it successively, therefore, again, it doesn't work with bas achas, and therefore what? He's not mikudeshes to either of them. Hachanami, therefore, says the Rosh as well. Hachanami, kevan dafara lesa basar hakama gam bebas achas lesa. So therefore, Rabbi say halacha Lamaisa. Therefore, because you can't do these things successively, right? Rabbi say you can't affirm a neder and then revoke it. So since ultimately, again, you can't do it successively, you also what? Can't do it simultaneously. And Rabbi say, now what does that mean? Halacha l'maisa for our purposes. So Rabbi say, so this is also in same Rambam. All this Rabbi say is in three halachas in the Rambam. Parakut Gimel halacha chaf beis. So watch this, Rabbi say. Here it is. Amar la kim umufar lech bebasachos. If a man says, right, father says to his daughter, right, the neder is affirmed and annulled for you. So Rabbi say, he's saying bebasachos. What is he saying? Kiyem umufar lechi. Rabbi say that's different than the previous case. What was the previous case? Kiyem lechi, mufar lechi. Two lashonos. So again, there we established wherever there's hafara, that's hafara, we're done. In this case, he's saying kiyem umufar lechi in one statement. What's the halacha? We'll say hare ze kayim. Ultimately, again, the neder is kayim. We'll say, now, what does it mean the neder is kayim? We'll say, what does that mean? What does that mean? The neder is kayim is another way of saying, essentially, the statement itself is meaningless. Then I will say, what is the de facto reality of saying the statement is meaningless? The neder is intact. Right? We'll say, just to be clear, if a girl makes a neder, right, and her father does nothing, what's the status of the neder? it's upheld. In other words, so over here, what the Rambam essentially is saying is, when you make this simultaneous contradictory statement, so the Maisa essentially, the neder is upheld. The neder is upheld, saying the statement is meaningless. In other words, we'll say, because again, you've made an inherently contradictory statement, kiyem umufar lechi. So again, those statements don't work together. So they don't work in succession. So because they don't work in succession, they also do not work simultaneously. Therefore, essentially, the statement is void. If the statement is void, the de facto reality is the neder is intact. Okay, beautiful. Beautiful. So let's go back there. So the Gemara goes ahead. The Gemara says, Bai Rabbi, I'll say another kasha. Kiyem lechi hayom. So it's very interesting. What happens if the father says, I uphold this neder for you today? The neder is upheld today. So now, what's the shayla mahu? Mi amrinan kiman da amar la mufar lechi lemachar. So say, do we say that inherent in that statement when he says, say, what's bothering us about that statement? What's bothering us about it? Today. Why did you say that? Why don't you just say the neder is upheld for you? Maybe what he's saying is like this. Maybe he's saying like this. The neder is upheld for you today, but tomorrow it's going to be revoked. It's going to be negated. So the Gemara says, so mahu miar mina kiman da amar la mufar lechi lemachar o dilma ha lo amar la. Rabbi says, so do we look at this statement as saying the neder, since he said the neder is affirmed for you today, that means tomorrow it's revoked, or do we say no? He didn't say anything about revocation. Okay, he chose to add in there today, but don't read into his statement something that is not there. So Rabbi say, take a look, by the way, at the Rush again for just a moment. The Rush says. So again, Boy Rabba Kaim Lechi Ayom Mao Miar Mina Kiman Da Amar Mufar Lechi Lemachar Dami Dim Lokain Amai Amar Hayom. Why else would he have put in Hayom? In other words, we'll say if he didn't mean to have the neder revoked tomorrow, why else would he have said Hayom? Elalav Mi Yisura Da Hayom Yesh Ladaktek Hayom Ye Kayim Aval Lemachar Ye Mufar Behischil Hafara Mi Hayom. Rabbi say that's why it's just interesting. By the way, just so you should understand, I found that on this particular daf, the Rush was just a little bit. I don't. You shouldn't think that I've had a falling out with the Ran. The Ran and I are good, right? We're on good terms. But if you see, the Rush is a bit more succinct on this daf than the Ran, and a bit more targeted. So that's why again we're going with the Rush over here. Shabbos say, this is incredible. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking also, let's take a look at this case. So, right, father says to his daughter, the neder should be affirmed for you today. So I will say, what's our shaila? How do we interpret that statement? Do we interpret it as meaning he's affirming the neder, done, or no? Why did he add on today? It must be that what is he saying? The neder should be affirmed for you today, but revoked for you tomorrow. So what are you thinking? Revoked for you tomorrow. The father doesn't have the power of revocation tomorrow. We'll say, when does the power of revocation exist? When it exist? Only today. So we'll say the Rush addresses this. That's why the Rush said, maybe since he's saying today, he's already begun the process of revocation today, but it will ultimately fully actualize when? Tomorrow. But since the process has begun today, therefore, it can actualize tomorrow. So we'll say, see, you hear that nuance? In other words, the Gemara is not suggesting that maybe when he says, let the neder be chal today, so today it'll be chal and tomorrow it'll be revoked. You can't revoke a neder the next day. It doesn't work. No. Maybe what he's saying is, I'm going ahead and uphold, today it should be upheld, but already today, I'm beginning the process of revocation, and tomorrow the process of revocation will concretize, will crystallize. But the process is being started today when the father still has the rights of revocation. So we'll say, so again, let's go to Ayin. I will say, this question actually doesn't resolve until the Mishnah. So we'll get as far as we can today. Imtim salomar ha lo amarla. So we'll say, on one end you could say, come on, why are you reading something that's not in his statement? No, let's just take the statement at face value. Father said to his daughter, your neder should be upheld today. It just means today. It doesn't mean anything about revocation. So halo amarla. So what if he said to her, amarla mufar lechi lemachar mahu? Okay, so let's reverse it. What if he said to her, your neder should be annulled tomorrow. Right? What if he said that? Your neder should be annulled tomorrow. What is the status ultimately, again, of such a statement? I will say, so once again, take a look at the Rush just quickly. The Rush says, Amar mufar lechi lemachar mahu mi'aminon midika Amar mufar lechi lemachar kiman damar kim hayom dami dim lokein amai amar lemachar. So we'll say, maybe when he says the neder should be annulled for you tomorrow, that's the equivalent of saying what? It should be upheld for you today. In other words, we'll say, otherwise, if you're not annulling until tomorrow, so then what's the status today? It must be if you're upholding today, then what? If you're annulling tomorrow, then today it must be upheld. So so the Gemara says, Amar la mufar lechi lemachar mahu. Mi'amina lemachar lo matzi mefer, da kaime l'nedarim hayom. Well, 1 second. You can't annul a neder tomorrow. Why? Because I will say, if you annul the neder tomorrow, what is that by definition? What did you do today? What did you do today? You affirmed it. Well, if you affirmed it already today, then Lamaisa, there's no annulment for tomorrow. Oh, Dilma, or the other possibility is, Kevan delo amar la kayim lechi hayom, ki amar la mufar lechi lemachar, mayom kamar. Maybe not. I will say, remember in this case, he never said to her, the neder should be chal today. Rather, what did he just say there in this case? The neder should be mufar tomorrow. Well, maybe when you say the neder should be annulled tomorrow, and you didn't say the neder should be annulled today, effectively what you're saying is what? The neder should be annulled as of today. Bimtim salomar, afilu hachi, kevan dekaimo hayom. I will say, maybe you'll say, since in our case, he upheld the neder today, lemachar kiman diise dami. Right? Ultimately, again, so I'll say, so since he said today, so ultimately, again, we'll view tomorrow, I should say the statement for tomorrow is being intact as well. What if he said, Kiem lechi sha'a mahu? What if he just would have said, listen to this. Your neder should be affirmed for an hour. For an hour. Mi aminon kiman da amar la mufar lechi la'achar sha'a dami? Rabbi says, is that the equivalent of saying, therefore what? Therefore what? That lamaisa, again, lamaisa, it should be annulled for you after. And Rabbi say, so you see in this case, I just want to be clear. We have one question in mind over here, right? What's our one question? Kiyem lechi hayom. Right? That's the question we started with over here. Ultimately, again, he's saying the neder should be affirmed for you today. And we'll say, how do we understand that statement? Is that just an affirmation and we just kind of ignore the hayom? Or maybe what? Or maybe what? No. What it means is it should be affirmed for you today and what? Annulled tomorrow. So we're just going through a whole bunch of different scenarios in order to answer this one question. So now we're asking, well, what if he said to her, the neder should be upheld for an hour? What's that status? Is that the equivalent of saying it's upheld for an hour, but then annulled after an hour? Oh, Dilma, halo amarla, or maybe not. I was supposed to say, he never said anything after the hour, right? So again, he said it for an hour, fine. I both say, what does it mean when a man says, when a father says the neder should be upheld for an hour? What does that mean? What does that mean? It's upheld. It's upheld. So if you say, listen, he didn't say anything to her about after the hour, so let's just leave that alone. So miu amarla mai. Or so what if he did say, what would be that halach? What if he would have said, the neder is upheld for an hour and revoked afterwards? Mai. Mi amrinan kevan de kaimu. Do we say, well, once you've affirmed a neder, the neder is affirmed, Rabbi say, and we're done. And we're done. There's nothing more to talk about. O Dilma, kevan de kule yome. Yoma bar hakama bar hafarahu miki amar mufar lechi la'achar sha'a mahani. Or do we see Rabbi say perhaps what? Since Rabbi is very interesting. Rabbi say the hour case is a little bit different than we've ever seen before. Why? This is actually very exciting. Very exciting. Rabbi say why is the hour case different? Because Rabbi say remember again, what's the window for hafara and hakama? What's the window? The day. The day. So maybe when you start getting into hours, right? Maybe you can't flip-flop on the same day. In other words, I will say, so I understand that once we say, once you affirm the neder is affirmed. I get that. But on the other hand, since that entire day that the neder was made, that is the window for affirmation and revocation, maybe halacha l'maisa, that actually allows you to flip-flop a little bit. So we'll say, you know what we'll do? We'll stop over here for today. So we'll say, again, we'll resolve, actually, let me just, all right, you know what, yeah. We'll stop over there. So I'm leaving you a little bit on the cliffhanger. We'll resolve this in Mirz Hashem tomorrow, but I will say, so again, just to highlight the question, so we have clarity with the question ultimately we're ending off with. It's the shaila of Kiem Lechi Hayom. So I'll say that's it. And what we see is this opens the window to, in general, when you append Hayom to your statement, do we read into that? Hayom, yes. Lamachar, lo. Or just what? Hayom is just an expression. Don't read anything more into it. Now, I'll say what that question did is it opened up the door to many other questions now that the after is out. I will say, by the way, I just want to point out, this is a yesodistic life shaila in general, which is when people say things, should you read into what people say or should you take them at their word? And I will say, by the way, this is a fundamental life shaila, right? Much machlokes in life has been generated because people read subtext into what people are saying instead of just taking people at their spoken word. So I will say, so again, this is a machlokes in life, a machlokes in Gemara, the resolution in Meretz Hashem for both, and Meretz Hashem tomorrow. Shkach, I will say. Oh, what a nice shalom.
Thank you. Had everything. Great. I've only been here in the dark, but so far what I see next door is very impressive.
It's great to see you.